Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us tonight, those of you in the room and those of you online as well. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Sir Michael Llewellyn-Smith. Sir Michael is a retired diplomat, an academic, and what you won't necessarily read or find out from using the Google, as my father calls it, is that he is an exceptionally generous and really fun man too. He has been a welcome friend to the BSA, certainly since he was ambassador in Greece from 1996 to 99. And we thoroughly enjoyed having him as visiting fellow. Now, this has created some discussion in the school because I think I remember you as visiting fellow in around 2001 when you and Colette stayed in the BSA. But other people remember you being here in 2007 as visiting fellow. Amelia is saying 2007.
Yes, when we did the wonderful carnival with Sir Michael.
I think leave it as a mystery.
Oh, no. That's, yeah, you're just proving my point about Google. So I remember him as visiting fellow in 2001, and I certainly remember having Colette here in 2001 as well, because I have some fabulous watercolors that she did for me too, of the AD's flat and things like that too.
She came about halfway through the fellowship.
Yeah. So anyway, I think I win, and we thoroughly enjoyed him. He continues his connections with the BSA as a vice president, as well as a regular visitor to the BSA, a contributor as an academic, and plotter of events as well. His generosity is really exemplified by his contributions to edited volumes, as well as his own edited works. For example, he edited a volume that is published in BSA Studies 2009 with Eleni Kaliga and Kytroumelidis, and that was on Scholars, Travels and Archives. And then the latest publication is the Macedonian Front with Basil Gounadis and Yannis Stefanidis in 2022, April 2022, I think.
Absolutely. Have you got that book, the signed copy?
Oh, I don't know. Evie? No, Evie said... No, yeah, we'll have to have a signed copy. Evie's coming for dinner later on, so she'll press you on it. He has, I mean, his publications are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of his wide-ranging interests, from the modern Olympics to his personal views of Crete in the book The Great Island, works on the culture of Athens and Greece in Asia Minor, the Ionian Vision. This actually is a really wonderful way to close our lecture series for this semester with Sir Michael's paper entitled A.A. Pallis From Greek Abroad to Greek in Greece. Thank you so much.
Well, did anyone notice the deliberate mistake in the type? Ξενιτεμενος Ελληνας. Think about that as we go on. It's just a spelling mistake, so it's my fault. Well, thank you for those kind words. As you say, I'm going to talk about A.A. Pallis, Alexandros Anastasios Pallis. I talked about him in Thessaloniki earlier this week, or it was probably last week, actually. And I said then that the audience knew more about the refugees in this part of the world than I do. And that's why I tried to find a rather different angle. And the angle was to talk about an individual, i.e. Pallis, who was himself heavily involved in refugee work throughout a great part of his life. And talking about him perhaps will bring the subject a bit closer to you, as well as being quite an entertaining way of approaching it, because as we were discussing just now, his book, which has, I understand, been reissued recently. I hope that's right, because I was saying in Thessaloniki it ought to be reissued. And not only ought it to be reissued, there ought to be an English translation of it, because the book is in Greek, but the audience will be, for a great part, English speakers. Pallis was the son of another Alexander, or Alexandros Pallis, a distinguished man who had a successful business career with Raleigh Brothers, the great trading company. He lived in Manchester and later Liverpool, and he spent some years in India, where Alexander Pallis, his son, was actually born in Mumbai. And there were siblings, all of whom were talented in one field or another. A lady became a natural historian, and one, Marcos Pallis, was a Himalayan climber who became a Buddhist, which is a very unusual career path, I would say. Pallis Sr. was a good businessman, but a rather austere character. He spent all his spare time at his passion, which was the Demotic language movement. He used his ample resources to support other demoticists, including Palamas and Eftaliotis, who also worked for Raleigh Brothers. And he translated Shakespeare and poetry and the Gospels into Demotiki. In fact, it was Pallis who provoked the famous Gospel riots early in the 20th century, which caused a number of deaths, and possibly, somebody said, set back the Demotic movement by a number of years. And the reason was that he took on the church in translating the Gospels, and Psycharis had advised him not to tackle the church yet, but to do one thing at a time. And that turned out to be pretty good advice, which he ignored. So I move on from the older Pallis to the younger A.A. Pallis, known as Ali Pali to some of his English friends, and Uncle Alex to his own family. And I'll call him just A.A. or Pallis for short. His father wanted him to have the best education possible and sent him to Eton. So you see, they had some money, but he won scholarships wherever he went. So it cost less than it might have done. And after Eton, he went to Balliol College, Oxford. And all this is described in his lovely memoir, which is here, which I found years and years ago in Athens. And it doesn't look as it should, because it was not a sort of hardback as it is here. And it contains the story of his life. He describes it as a biographical memoir. And it's called Ξενιτεμενος Ελληνας. And the deliberate mistake was that the iota, which I put in the title, is wrong, because it should be an eta. It was published in 1954 by Aetos here in Athens, and I do strongly recommend it. It takes the reader through his life, the early years in India, which he loved, schooling in the north of England, Manchester and later Liverpool, in Eton, which I mentioned, where he began to meet people from the upper crust of British life, whose friendship was useful to him, and Balliol College, ditto. And then he went and became a civil servant, I think he must have had dual nationality, because otherwise he wouldn't have been able to do this. And he found work in the civil service in Egypt, which was then being run by the British under the great proconsul, Lord Cromer. And finally, he came at last to Greece, which he first visited at Easter 1902 as part of a tour of Greek lands. From 1913 on, AA was involved in refugee questions, and he writes about this in his memoir, but also in articles which he wrote between the wars on, e.g., racial migrations in the Balkans, which was published in the Geographical Journal in 1925. I can give all the references if you need them after giving this talk at some point. Pallis writes that during the 17 years of his service in Greece, the country had to face successive wars: the Great War of 15 to 18, the expedition to the Ukraine in 1919, and the Asia Minor campaign of 1919 to 22. And the result of all of these was the waves of refugees which submerged Greece and for years absorbed all the forces and resources of the nation. Quote, "I lived this drama not as a simple spectator, but as someone charged with organizing the relief and establishment of the refugees in Macedonia, in Thrace, in Old Greece, or the islands, to study on the spot the numerous problems generated by this tragedy of Romeosini." The list of his appointments shows how he was in an exceptional position to follow the movements of migration since they began. Here is a part of his curriculum vitae. Relief officer in Macedonia in 1913. Secretary General of the Refugees Settlement Commission in Hellenic Macedonia in 1914 to 15. Deputy Governor General of Salonika in 1917 to 1918. Hellenic Commissioner for the Resettlement of Eastern Thrace and the Marmara Littoral in 1919 to 20. And then, as Hellenic Delegate on the Commission for the Exchange of Minorities, the exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey in 1923 to 24. He was associated with the transfer and settlement of the populations concerned and had access to all the official records and statistics. Pallis notes that from the outbreak of the Balkan War, the First Balkan War, in October 1912, up to the mid-1920s, Macedonia had witnessed no less than 17 migratory movements in either direction, or in many directions, a more or less constant flow of populations between the various territories of the Southern Balkans and from one side of the Aegean to the other. They started in 1912 with the advance of the armies of the Balkan allies, the Greeks on Salonika, the Serbs on Skopje and Monastir, the Bulgars on Kavala and Salonika. AA was in on this from the very beginning when he arrived in Salonika in summer 1913, just after the Battle of Kilkis. He found then the mosques and the Muslim other religious buildings full of refugees which came from the interior, mainly from northern Macedonia, Skopje, Monastir, Kosovo, areas occupied by the Serbian army. These were the descendants of Muslims established in northern Macedonia in the time of Murat I. And not wishing to settle under the Greeks, they now, at this point, took the road eastwards. They were big, fair-haired people, simple peasants in Pallis's description, and they followed their hodjas. In August 1913, the first Greek refugees or migrants started to arrive from Strumnica, Yevgeli, and Monastir. These areas had gone to Bulgaria and Serbia under the Treaty of Bucharest on the 10th of August 1913. Strumnica was mainly Slav-speaking and Monastir mainly Vlach-speaking. So this is just an indication of how complex things are, language-wise as well as other things. And so the great migrations began. On top of these movements generated by the Balkan Wars, one day some 10,000 Greeks arrived in Salonika from the Caucasus, where the Greeks had heard of Greek successes in the Balkan War. The Greeks of Kars in the east were farmers who cultivated the lands of Georgian and Circassian super rich people. The Greek word seems to be megistanon or megistanon. I'm not sure where the accent falls. Word had reached them that the Greek government planned to distribute the Turkish chiefliks. And so the Greeks of the Caucasus descended on Batum and found ships to take them to Macedonia. And this migration was not a great success because these ex-Russian Greeks turned out to be a wild lot and settled provisionally in Veria and Kilkis in abandoned chiefliks. They provoked a stream of complaints to the authorities. Everything I say is drawn from Pallis's book or his articles. You get the idea that one move provoked another, causing endless trouble. But these were Greeks and must somehow be cared for. And the same was happening pari passu with the Muslims, the Bulgars, and others. Well, the story continues in 1914. Turkish refugees, stirred up by the Hodjas and by the young Turks, descended from frontier areas of Greek Macedonia and areas occupied by Bulgaria and crowded the stations on the Thessaloniki-Dediagach railway, seeking to make their way to Ottoman lands. Turkey accused Greece of provoking this migration. Of course, this was a difficult time, as so often in Greek-Turkish relations, what with the still unresolved disputes over the Aegean Islands and the future of northern Epirus, Albania. The next move came from the Turkish side. Having reached Ottoman territory, the migrants threw the Greek inhabitants out of their houses in eastern Thrace and in Asia Minor and settled there themselves. The Greeks were bundled onto ships and deposited at Salonika harbour. It was at this point that there was, not for literally the first time, but the first time in Greek experience, I think, there was mention of a voluntary exchange of populations. And it seems to have been the Turkish ambassador to Greece who proposed this exchange. But as you know, it did not come to fruition and it was interrupted by the outbreak of the Great War. Following these developments above, in the Second Balkan War in 1913, there was a move of some 13,000 Bulgarians who followed the retreating Bulgarian army into Bulgaria. The districts affected included mainly Kilkis, but also Demirhisar and Serez. And Pallis adds to all the above the settlement in Macedonia after the Balkan Wars of up to 10,000 Greeks from Old Greece. These were officials, gendarmes from Crete, etc. And he goes on to consider the effect of all these movements on the distribution of races in Macedonia and Thrace. You can see how complicated this process was, with the comings and goings, often over the same track in different directions. And I also wanted to show how this was not just a Greek-Turkish phenomenon or Greek-Bulgarian-Turkish. It included movements of Greeks from the Caucasus and others. And Macedonia was not the only territory affected. Others very much were Constantinople and Western Asia Minor. So complication is one feature, and another is the length of the process over time. The list starts in 1913 and reaches a sort of conclusion in the exchange of populations formalized at Lausanne in 1923, when the Balkans and Anatolia had already been in turmoil since the start of the Balkan Wars. But of course, that was not the real conclusion, because the effects were felt over a very long period. In Churchill's words in his book, The Aftermath, so long a period, I suppose, that you could say that they still exert an influence today. In fact, they certainly do exert an influence on academics, because the other day I was hearing a talk by a lady from St. Antony's College precisely about the refugees and the memories of the refugees, which are at several generations distance by now. Pallis had already met many of the important Greeks of Constantinople and Macedonia, and during the Balkan Wars, he found work organizing or improvising a hospital. In the period when Stephanos Dragoumis was Governor General of Macedonia, he was able to use his contacts made in Constantinople, Pallis was able to use them, and found that work was thrust upon him. He already knew the Dragoumis family well, and Ion Dragoumis was a great influence on him. In fact, he lists 3 people who were his main influences, and Dragoumis was one of them. His education, his common sense, and his bilingualism were good qualifications in a period in which he was going to meet many of the important Greeks of Macedonia. And the language meant that his close relations, which were demanded during the Great War with the British and the French allies, were facilitated. He was made an interpreter and given a military rank, and he was able to be a go-between, for instance, between Sarai and the Greeks, and very much between the British and the Greeks. Pallis became heavily and fully involved with refugee questions in 1914, when the Greek refugees driven out of Anatolia and Thrace arrived. Venizelos had appointed Miltiadis Negrepontis to be in charge of housing and relief for the refugees. Negrepontis went on to be a minister in Venizelos' government. He was energetic and effective, but he didn't last long in the post because of internal opposition by the prosecution service and the press. So he was forced to resign. And in the next few years, Pallis had to operate against a background of political entanglements involving the Greek administration, the Allied forces, and the local populations. He needed all his skills. He regretted the departure of Dragoumis and Negrepontis, and he deplored the arrival of Emmanuel Repoulis, who he had no admiration for at all. He found Repoulis too often absent from his post, too suspicious, and too centralizing. all of these, I suppose, were not unique to Repulis, but he did become Venizelos' deputy, so he was in a particularly important position. And it was a pity that he didn't quite live up to expectations. When the Salonika uprising took place in 1916, A.A. Pallis was one of the first to join. He claims to have seen that if Greece stayed out of the war and remained neutral any longer, there was a risk of losing Macedonia altogether, probably to the Serbs, who were, as it were, the favored children of the Allies. They would be the winners. The Revolutionary Committee put him and one other in charge of the tax registers of the Salonika economic ephoria, drawing on his earlier experience, for instance, in Egypt and in Greece, of economic affairs. Pallis's assessment of the Venizelis kinema was unfavorable. There was too much party politics and too much maneuvering for position. The pursuit of political opponents went too far and took in not just politicians and the military, but traders and ordinary citizens. His account goes some way to justify the condemnation of the Venizelos administration of this period, e.g. the methods used in conscription to the Venizelis army. In his role as officer-interpreter, Pallis was attached to the staff of the Archipelago Division in the Florina Monastir sector of the front under General Ioannou. And he gives an amusing account of Ioannou, who was a very brave soldier, even foolhardy, a real palikari. And he refers to Mirivilis' book, Zoe and Tavo, but comments that the book is actually unfair to Ioannou. This was the period of difficulties over conscription and indeed retention of soldiers. And Pallis notes that though Ioannou was far from bloodthirsty, he felt that he had to order a small number of executions so as to preserve or restore the morale of the regiment. When the Great Fire took place in 1917, the then Governor-General, Periklis Argyropoulos, put Pallis in charge of organizing relief for the victims of the fire, one of many moves he had to make in response to emergencies. At the end of 1917, he was appointed General Secretary of the Administration, i.e. the government. In his constant dealings with the Allies, he found it much easier to get on with the British than with the French, who played what he called political games. But the removal of Sarai and the appointment of General Guillaumin improved things. Again, he is full of good anecdotes about the personalities, including Eleni Argyropoulou, Ioannis Koundouriotis, the younger brother of the admiral, Alexandros, the regent of Serbia, and others. And somehow he became involved in the affair of King Alexander with Aspasia-Manu. This happened through his uncle, Agamemnon Pallis, who was head of King Constantine's military establishment and found himself in jail in Athens in curious circumstances. What happened was that there was a continual flow of correspondence, secret, supposedly secret, between Constantine and Alexander. And two soldiers were sent carrying letters for Alexander. I suppose Constantine was urging Alexander all the time to preserve the position of Constantine himself, who by then was in Switzerland in exile. And these two soldiers were caught and were arraigned. And Pallis's uncle was called as a witness at the trial. and was asked by the famous prosecutor, infamous maybe, Joseph Kundros, why he had not denounced the two royalist officers for carrying these letters. And he replied that it would have been against his military honor to do so. As a result of this alleged contempt for the law court, he was jailed in the Averov prison, where he remained until after the November 1920 elections. And on his release, it's a sad story, he suffered a stroke and remained bedridden until his death. And this sad story leads A.A. Pallis to reflect on the enormity of the schism and its effects. He completed his time in Salonika working as General Secretary for Anastasis Adosidis, whom he called an excellent man and who had succeeded Argyropoulos. And he was then posted to Constantinople, where he spent much of the years 1918 to 1924. After the armistice of Mudros on the 30th of October 1918, he had to supervise the return of the Greeks of Eastern Thrace and Asia Minor, who during the Great War had been sent into the interior by the Turks, many of them sent as far as Syria or Mesopotamia. And here again, he was much involved with the Allied occupation, in particular with the British, who carried more weight than the others, including the Greek High Commissioner, Epithemios Kanellopoulos. He found that the Greeks were very much gathered around the Patriarchate, and the Patriarch at the time was Meletios Metaxakis, a Cretan, a very dynamic man, a Venizelist, and somebody who is, I guess, remembered both for good and perhaps by the non-Venizelists for ill. The big task was to deal with the returning Greeks coming back from the interior of Turkey. And Pallis became government representative on the committee set up under the aegis of the Patriarch to deal with the refugee problem. The actual president of the committee was the Bishop of Enos, Joachim. Within a few months, apparently 300,000 had been repatriated. The contrast was frightening between the well-provided for Allied officers and senior officials and the newly poverty-stricken old Turks and the refugees. The refugees from Russia, cast up by the Bolshevik Revolution and the wretched remains of Wrangel's White Russian army, were in a similar position to the old Turks, destitute, selling their icons and jewels, and seeking employment where they could find it. I quote Pallis on the sort of picture of this period. Within a few weeks, he says, the shops and restaurants of the Pera were full of women of the Russian aristocracy who acted as salespeople or maidservants. In the cabarets and night spots, there were Georgian princes and Cossack officers seeking places as doorkeepers or dancers. You saw elderly generals and senior officials of the former Russian Empire selling newspapers in the streets or playing the violin in the orchestras of dancing clubs. And on the banks of the Bosphorus, Russian restaurants were springing up like mushrooms where you could eat black caviar, borscht, blini, and other Russian food. And so began the great tragedy of the Russian emigration, which I saw, I as Pallis, at close quarters later in Greece, Yugoslavia, Syria, and elsewhere. As a moderate Venizelist, Pallis put himself forward as a candidate for the famous election in November 1920. and he was a candidate in the Salonika area. He describes vividly his attempt to canvass support. He says that most of the Venizelos candidates didn't bother to go out into the countryside and canvass because they assumed they were going to win. Venizelos was going to win. And there's a sort of confirmation there about the blindness which prevailed at that time. But Pallis did go out canvassing, and in a certain village where the villagers had refused to be conscripted, and Condilis's bravos had punished them by burning all their haystacks, in this village, he stood up with some other Venizelos candidates to address the local people. He addressed the villagers, or his colleagues did, who followed the proceedings in a deathly silence. And as soon as it was over, they all stood up and shouted, "Long live Constantine!" And they left the hall, a warning that was ignored, as you know, because Venizelos lost the election. I don't think Pallis ever stood for parliament again. However, he did continue to do good works, including in Athens, and not only in the field of refugee settlement. In January 1921, he was in the Plaka with Admiral Koundouriotis, and he very nearly fell victim to an attack while they were distributing foodstuffs and gifts sent from America to the needy. And two masked thugs broke in and fired shots. One of them hit the admiral in the belly, and the other hit Pallis in the face. So, you know, it was serious stuff, but neither of them were very seriously injured, glad to say. In his works for the refugees, as I mentioned, he spent time in Constantinople, and he became useful to Patriarch Meletios at a time when Venizelos was in Lausanne negotiating the treaty. And Pallis got to know the Patriarch pretty well because Meletios used him with his fluency in languages as a channel to the British authorities and journalists. Meletios had decided that there was no future for the Patriarchate in Constantinople, and it should move to Mount Athos or possibly Salonika. And he wired to Venizelos in this sense. Pallis was actually present when Venizelos' reply was received. It was secret and personal and negative. And Venizelos told Meletios to resign, actually, which Meletios resented, and he burst out in frustration in front of Pallis. But Venizelos was not to be moved, and Pallis was charged with arranging for his departure with the British authorities. And all seemed well, but the Patriarch kept putting it off and not leaving, probably hoping for a reprieve. The reprieve never came, and finally he had to leave, and he left on a British steam launch, which transferred him to an Egyptian ship. And Pallis concludes, "So ended a tragic chapter in the history of the great church." As you know, however, this was not the end of Meletios, because he became Patriarch of Alexandria from 1926 to 1935. So you can't keep a patriarch down. For the rest of his time in the city, a few months, Pallis was much concerned with the thousands of refugees who arrived crammed like animals into the holds of Turkish ships, which brought them from the Pondos and brought with them a bad attack of typhus. It is called in the Greek exanthimatiki, and I don't know precisely what that variety of typhus entails. Anyway, it was serious. Pallis remarks that the way the Allies allowed the Turkish authorities to house these refugees in various lodgings in the city centre with the risk of spreading the infection was typical of the paralysis which affected the Allied authorities at this time. Mortality was high, including among the doctors and nurses. And Near East relief and some brave individuals did what they could to help. And General Harrington, the British commander whose common sense solved the Chanak crisis a bit later, was moved by seeing some wretched refugees on a lighter in a pitiable state, and he earmarked the Selimiye barracks for the use of the refugees, shades of Florence Nightingale, and insisted that effective sanitary measures should be taken. And so, after the initially high mortality, gradually life returned to a more normal rhythm. Pallis describes these measures and how he and others donned white blouses to protect themselves. And so we come to the climactic event, the Smyrna catastrophe, precipitating the flight of thousands, and followed by the Lausanne Treaty and Convention on the Exchange of Populations. Once again, Pallis was called on. In autumn 1923, he was appointed to the Mixed Committee for the Exchange of Greek and Turkish Populations. This must have been one of the busiest times for him. And he gives a graphic description of the events that followed the armistice of Mudanya, the 29th of September 1922, which gave a 1-month deadline for the departure of the Greek army from Eastern Thrace. That year, the harvest was exceptionally good, and Foreign Minister Politis sent an urgent telegram telling Pallis to leave for Adrianople and to buy up the harvest on account of Nansen and the League of Nations, so as to prevent the Turks from getting their hands on it. The Greek government opened a credit of 100 million drachmas to cover the expense. But it was all fruitless, because when he arrived in Adrianople, Pallis found the railways and the motor vehicles all reserved for the army's evacuation. And buying up the corn was out of the question. The Greek population of Eastern Thrace was already on the move with their ox carts and baggages, as described by Ernest Hemingway in the famous quotations which everybody uses. And Pallis returned to Constantinople to deal with the influx of refugees from the Pontus and Northwest Asia Minor. So I think let us leave him there and not take him on further into his long career of hard work and philanthropy. I got to know him slightly when he lived here in Athens, and I was here many years ago. A senior and respected member of the Greek and British communities. As I mentioned, I can't recommend his memoir too highly, and if I can get my hands on this reprint, then everybody else can too, and I recommend that you do. It is absolutely full of good anecdotes, pen pictures of interesting characters, Esat Pasha and other Turks, and all sorts of refugees, all sorts of Greek colleagues. And it's a travelogue with adventures in Montenegro, as well as his time in Egypt and so on. So if you see a copy, do snap it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that fabulous paper, wide-ranging and really interesting perspective to see from his point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I'm sure there are lots of questions. Liz will be monitoring questions online, and if we have questions from the audience.
No guarantee that I can answer them. but I'll try, obviously. Yes, Christos.
I have a funny question, actually. It might be just a figment of my imagination. You said that he was called Ali Pali amongst his family as a nickname.
No, I said he was Ali Pali, I think mainly to the British.
To the British.
And he was Uncle Alex.
Okay, Ali Pali to the British. Wasn't Ali Pali the nickname of Alexander Pallis in London, which was the first place where the BBC was held with all the bush house?
Probably was, yeah. Yeah.
That was a question.
I'm sure you're right. Yeah.
In Brighton, isn't there an Italian Brighton?
Anyway,
Of course, he worked in London too later on, and he wrote other books as well. I mean, foremost among them was the book he wrote about the Asia Minor imbroglio, Greece's venture, not Anatolian venture, and after, which is a wonderful book. It's terrific, I think. And he published that in the 1930s. So he waited until the dust had settled. And that meant he was able to describe all the aftermath himself. And he wrote a book, which I haven't got, called Greek Miscellany, of all his various essays, and I must get hold of it.
I'm going to take advantage of my position here as chair, and just I'm really curious to know if you get a sense of whether he knew what was happening at the time, whether he had any sense of the enormity of what was about to happen. So he gets posted up in Thessaloniki, and then starts dealing with, small pockets of refugee crises. And do you get a sense that he had, and he could anticipate all of the horrors that were about to happen?
I don't get that sense, actually. I think, like many Greeks, it was so awful to think in those terms that they didn't think in those terms until it happened. I mean, of course, there were some who did think like that. Possibly even Venizelos did, but that was too late and he was out of power anyway. But quite a lot of people didn't. And I don't think Pallis did. I think he just went on with his work, which I suppose was an admirable thing to do, and made the transition to post-1922 with some ease because he was buried in the work. But he doesn't make any reference, as far as I know, in the book to having foreseen things.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
He obviously sounds a fascinating person. He's a traveller, he's a civil servant, he tried politics, and you say you met him. I mean, what's the motivation? I mean, what drove him to do all these things that he did? I mean, he befriended
I think he was much influenced by his education in England. And he makes that clear in the book because he kept meeting people at Balliol and at Eton, who then crop up later in life. And his friendship with them was able to help him in accomplishing the work that he did. I don't know if there's more I can say than that. He didn't himself, he looked like a fairly sedentary figure when I knew him. And the person who knew him better than I did was Anthony Breyer, because Breyer was here just before I was, and then we coincided for a bit. And of course, Breyer had been at Balliol. So that was a link between them. I'm sure they talked about Balliol. Alas, Anthony Breyer, the late Anthony Breyer. So that's not really much of an answer, but it's...
Well, somebody else.
At the back.
Oh, sorry, Michalis.
It's kind of a similar question to the previous one. In terms of why he wrote the memoir. I mean, sometimes it's just to narrate one's life, but I'm wondering why he took the decision
Well, I mentioned his being influenced by his education in England. And that's part of the reason why I wrote the memoir, because in the introduction to it, he writes how this sort of personal memoir is a feature of English letters, life and letters, whereas it wasn't in Greece. Maybe it is now, certainly more than in the past, but still there's a reluctance sometimes on the part of Greek authors to write this sort of rather flexible, graceful, anecdotal memoir, and to do your serious work in a different context, as Pallis did with these expert journals, which he wrote. So, I mean, it's all there. And he calls it a personal memoir, autobiographico chronico. And he says, Ξενιτεμενος Ελληνας, there's a photo of him here, but it's very difficult to find a good photograph of him. He quotes Somerset Maugham on the early pages, the razor's edges, and then he has a prologue in which he says, well, I'm not going to try and read it in Greek, but he says, it makes the point I made about it being a part of English literature, but not Greek. And so he thought it would be a good thing to write the memoir, so to introduce this sort of writing to Greece. That's what that's what motivated him, I think. And also because he'd had a very interesting life, so why not write about it?
Here's another question here.
Yeah, Philip.
You mentioned that the first idea of the exchange of populations was suggested by the Patriarch, I think you said in 1913. I've got that right.
Not the Patriarch, by Galip Kemal, the Turkish ambassador.
The Turkish ambassador?
Yeah.
Sorry, I got that wrong. That changes the tone of my question, which was then that you also mentioned that the Patriarch had suggested moving the Patriarchate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Had it been, I'm going to twist my question now, had it been the Patriarch who had suggested the exchange of population, whenever it was in 1913, long before the actual exchange of populations, and given the genocide of the Armenians in 1916, might a lot of death and trouble have been saved? I'm asking you as a historian and fan of Venizelos. In other words, the pretext for Venizelos to go in wouldn't have been there, would it?
Historians are very keen not to go too far into supposition about what might have happened. And I think for good reason. And also on Venizelos, you said I was a fan of Venizelos. I'm a fan of the first part of his life. But I think he lost it in a way as time went on. And after all, he ended up taking part in and approving a coup d'etat, which is not a sensible thing to do. But anyway, going back to Venizelos and the Patriarch and whether it could have saved lives, I think the question of where the Patriarchate should be located is a very difficult one to answer. I mean, Meletios was not a fool at all. He was a very intelligent man. And he thought that the Patriarchate would be imprisoned if it stayed in Constantinople by the Turks. And in a way, that's true. Look at what happened afterwards. The argument, on the other hand, which was taken in the end by Venizelos and by his colleagues was that the international dimension of the Patriarchate and the Orthodox Church was such that, and the close ties with Constantinople and Hagia Sophia, it was so important that it should stay there, the Patriarchate should stay there. And that view prevailed, and I wouldn't dispute that view. Meletios himself, as I said, went on to be patriarch somewhere else, so he was out of the picture after being forced to resign by Venizelos. And he was a tough Cretan. Interesting man, like Venizelos. Sorry, I haven't answered your question. Yeah.
Are there any questions online, Liz? We have a comment from Lucia Nixon, who wants to note your clear exposition of the many different migrated groups involved in this period of Pallis's life, or to note how important it is to realize it wasn't just the supposed binary of Greeks and Turks.
Was that a question or was it a statement?
A statement. A
statement. Good. No. So I don't need to answer it. Yeah, I agree with him. Yeah.
I mean, on that, it must have been extremely difficult to make sense within those groups as well of how life could continue on in any particular way, given the enormity of it all.
The refugees.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I've just been at a conference in Thessaloniki about the refugees, and this came out in many of the presentations. Enormously difficult, but a terrific effort went into it. I mean, that's what's so impressive. And it wasn't only by the Greeks, obviously, but the Americans very much, Near East relief and so on, and lots of others. And they got on with it. And I asked a question in Thessaloniki as to whether there were disputes and difficulties between the Greek government and the various bodies who were helping, such as Near East Relief and so on. And the answer was yes, there were difficulties. You know, as with any enormous project, it's difficult to carry through, but the spirit was such that they did carry it through successfully. Sorry, I got a frog in my throat.
I'd have to get you a glass of wine.
A vatra cost.
A question behind Ed.
It's outside the scope of the talk, but can you give a rough idea of what happened to him after different parts of public life?
He worked at the Greek embassy in London for a time. And I'm not aware of other things he did beyond the sort of refugee period, which lasted up until the 1930s, because he was commissioned by the League of Nations to do a sort of intellectual account of the whole period and the refugee migrations. So presumably, I mean, he went all over the place to do that. He went to Syria, he went to, obviously, the Near East. And that will have taken him, I think, well into the 1930s. But he also worked at the Greek embassy in London.
Yeah, I have a question which is perhaps not really fair, but anyway, it was provoked by your comment about your first volume about Venizelos.
Yeah.
Yes, which I read and I very much enjoyed. And I'm looking for the second volume. What are you at work on this? And can we expect to see it soon? Because I'm pretty excited by this. On the other hand, what you said, it sounds like you don't kind of enjoy this period of Venizelos' life.
Well, I don't enjoy the period between the after the Treaty of Lausanne. Mm-hmm. I don't enjoy the period as much as I would like to, because it's a period of coup d'etat, Pangalos in power and so on. And I only have a sort of limited interest in that. Of course, I knew another Pangalos. But the answer on the second volume is there's quite a lot of it is written, but there's still quite a lot still to write. And of course, the bits which still to write tend to be the difficult bits, which one leaves to the end. So I will go back home with the call ringing in my ears to get on with it, and I'll do that. But also everything that's happening at the moment here, and I didn't really mention this, but the outpouring of interest in Greece, in Asia Minor, what happened in Asia Minor, in the Lausanne and all the rest, is such that I didn't want to miss that. But this is fatal, because if you wait for the next book to be published, you're never going to do your own book. So I must set that aside. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes. On the subject of refugees, are there any accounts on refugees from the other side, the Turkish population?
Yeah, there are, but I'm not a Turkish speaker, so I'm not very good. Well, the ones that one knows about are, for instance, a book by Renée Hirschhorn from Oxford University, and she worked on the refugees here in near Piraeus, and she's still producing, and she's producing a third edition of her book, which is about the refugees. That's about the Greek refugees. But there's another book by Bruce Clark, which is about both the Greek and the Turkish refugees. I've forgotten the title, but yeah. And that's a very interesting book, and Bruce Clark is an interesting person, and it's well worth reading.
I think we'll make you the last question.
George.
Go ahead.
Venturing on this one, because it struck me that there are people who are missing from work.
Many, yeah.
And some are more missing than others.
Mm-hmm.
And one name, for example, is Lehman von Landers.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that he wasn't sent the mission he was, which was agreed by powers. It was a private journey. He first went and then began and so on. The first to order migration was a German staff general, Lehman von Landers. What the hell happened there? I mean, we know, I think, what was done to him. He was pulled back. No, not too, you've gone too far. But did he fade out of the picture, really? Because you have very few powers, legitimate or a bit or partly, that play a major role. They come and go, they vanish. I mean, it's a bit like a common room.
Yeah.
Yeah, by the door, they stop for a second, one or two people linger. But on the whole, they go through it. And so on. Only, to me, the Menetius, the patriarch story is entirely new to me, fascinating.
It's very interesting. And what is interesting about that is that I came across some correspondence which suggests strongly that Venizelos, to begin with, was convinced that Meletios was right, but then he changed his mind. So he must have. Yeah. 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 I don't know about Leman von Sanders. I honestly don't know, but it's just one other sign of the nefarious influence of the great powers, not just Germany, but others too.
No, certainly not. That only had beginning, middle, and end structure, which is, I don't think any other power did that sort of thing to any other power.
No. Thank you, George.
So with that, we'd like to say another thank you very much to Mike.
Thank you.
Lovely discussion too from everybody here. And this is our last seminar of the semester, and I'd like to say a huge thank you to our school students, Liz, who's sitting here, and Rachel, who is somewhere behind, and our Leventis postdoc, who is also always helping out too. And thank you very much for all your help and support of the FHS seminars. And to Sula, who produces the most amazing food for everyone as well. So thank you guys too. And it's Liz's birthday tomorrow.
Right.
And if you'd like to join us for a drink in the salon, just across the hall, do have a drink.
Right, I must put my papers together. I think.
Thank you so much.
Well. It's all a bit